Hi, everybody, and welcome to A Mighty Blaze's Celebrity Conversations. I am your host, Jane Roper, author of Double Time, and I am so excited to have with us today two fabulous authors. We have Nicole Dennis-Benn and Lisa Selin Davis with the new book, Tomboy. Both authors are joining us from the People's Republic of Brooklyn, and we're so excited to have you both with us today. Welcome, welcome.
Thank you.
So I'll just do some brief intros, and then I'm going to turn it over to you two to talk about Tomboy and about writing and whatever else happens to come up. So first, Nicole Dennis-Benn is the author of the acclaimed novel Patsy, which Time magazine called stunning, and the debut novel Here Comes the Sun, which was named a New York Times Notable Book of the Year and an NPR, Amazon, Barnes & Noble Best Book of 2016. Nicole is a Lambda Literary Award winner and a recipient of a New York Foundation for the Arts Artist Grant. Vice named her among immigrant writers, authors who are making American literature great again. I like that version of the slogan much better. Her writing has appeared in publications including the New York Times, Elle Magazine, Catapult, Ebony, and Feminist Wire. Nicole was born and raised in Kingston, Jamaica, and currently lives with her wife in Brooklyn, New York. Welcome, Nicole. And Lisa Selin Davis is the author of 2 novels and about 600 essays and articles about film and travel and the environment and real estate and parenting for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, Yahoo, and many other publications. Her new book is Tomboy, The Surprising History and Future of Girls Who Dare to Be Different. In it, Davis explores the evolution of tomboyism from a Victorian ideal to a 21st century fashion statement, honoring the girls and women and those who identify otherwise, who stomp all over archaic gender norms. Publishers Weekly, in a starred review, calls it a thorough and engrossing investigation, a persuasive and deeply personal argument for moving beyond the gender binary. Originally from Saratoga Springs, New York, Lisa lives in Brooklyn with her husband and 2 kids. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you.
Right, so I'm going to turn it right over to you, Nicole, to take it away.
Yes. First of all, Lisa, it's a pleasure and an honor to interview you. I read this book and fell in love with it. I am just in awe. I have many women like your daughter in my life, so it was just so great to read it and to know, pick your brain, to know have a conversation with you on this platform. So first of all, I just want those who are tuning in who have not read the book and who had not read the great Publishers Weekly review of the book, just tell us about the book, like your inspiration behind the book, and why it was so important to you to write it now.
Well, thanks for saying all those nice things about the book, and thanks for reading it, and thanks for interviewing me. I love your work so much, and I'm so excited to talk to you. So the book, well, I didn't know it was a book, of course, for a long time, as always happens. But I would say what happened first was I had a daughter who at about age 3, when a lot of girls are really starting to conform and go through this kind of princess phase, I had a kid who wasn't doing that. And in the beginning, I wrote a little bit about what that was like as someone who was like a raised hardcore feminist, to kind of have my kid doing what I would dream of, but also being very confused by it. Like all the girls are doing that and you're not, and what does it mean, and worrying and wondering. And then in 1st grade, she came home and said she was a tomboy. And someone had clearly, some kid must have been talking to his or her, or their parent, and said, like, there's this, it was a topic of conversation in the school sometimes, of like, how could this possibly be a girl? And then the parents would have to explain. So clearly someone explained, oh, that's a tomboy. And then that kid gave that word to my child. And she brought it home to us. And that was the beginning of like, oh, right. I forgot about that word. I forgot that my whole childhood was filled with girls who looked like that. That even I was dressed in, unisex clothes, which of course were boys' clothes. They were everywhere in the media. That was phase 1. phase 2 is fast forward a couple of years when we're talking more about trans kids in the media for the first time. And so because I live in a super liberal place, there were so many like well-meaning adults who knew my child really well, but who were kind of obsessively asking if she wanted to change her pronoun, if she wanted to change in the boys' locker room, and these like really wonderful, generous things, except like after a while, it really started to feel like, oh, you don't believe her, that she can be a girl and be like that. And that was a very interesting tension of like, oh, well, how do we support trans kids and yet not reinforce gender stereotypes? Because she's doing all these things that tomboys in my youth were encouraged to do. So I wrote about that. I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, and in a way that I thought was really sensitive. And it ignited, it had a big response. And a lot of it was positive and supportive. And also from people kind of being like, yeah, what did happen to the tomboys, and how do we wrestle with this moment? And then other people saying, you know, you're endangering trans people, you don't understand these words, you don't understand what gender is, and I decided to, after a while, after recovering from being the kind of cancel culture that I hadn't experienced, I decided to reach out to some of those people who said I didn't understand and ask them to explain it to me. And so those are all the kind of conflicting twists and turns and forces that eventually led me to realize like there's a lot to unpack here. And I had no idea what I would discover when I set out to do it. So that was kind of exciting too. Like, I don't know anything about this topic. I think I'll write a book about it.
Yeah, what I love about this book is like, I mean, you unpacking this term tomboy, you know, whether it's a misnomer, because yeah, I do agree that, you know, it's a girl. The person is a girl, and I kind of as I was reading your book, I saw that tug of war. You know, is she trans? Is she tomboy? Like, where did tomboy go? And so can you talk about that some more in terms of what was your experience? Because I was also horrified. I felt your horror in when you you know, how you described it in chapter 12, where you know, you were just simply writing an essay about your tomboy daughter, or, you know, expressing herself in a way that our gendered box doesn't really allow us to express it, right? And saying, you know, even the title itself, you know, saying writers, we don't make our own titles, you know, it just happened that the editor stamped that title on it. And then all of a sudden you started getting all these messages in your inbox, right? What was that like? Because I feel like now you are put on a pedestal all of a sudden to now unpack trans and gender nonconformity as well as tomboyness. It's like, you know, that's a huge task, right? So how were you able to pick yourself up and say, okay, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to study, research, and, you know, write more about this topic?
Yeah, you know, one of the things that's interesting also about experiencing those kind of public shaming and attacks was just how people who wanted to support me would write me emails privately. People who wanted to debate would do that on Facebook. And then people who just wanted to ruin me would do that on Twitter for all to see. And that was like that in itself is kind of fascinating. But I also felt that, you know, this book is very much, it's not about my child. She kind of bookends it in the introduction and in the conclusion, but I only wanted to use our experience as the entry point, you know, into this. And so I also felt like I needed to learn this new language of gender that many young people are familiar with, but I didn't understand it myself. I feel like Nicole is frozen.
I don't think so. Oh, maybe Nicole. Nicole is frozen.
I didn't want to
stand by. See.
I don't know if I should keep going because we're talking.
Oh, we lost her. She'll be back.
Okay.
I think you could keep going. I think that's okay.
But I want to talk to Nicole.
Yeah.
Okay. So she asked me about unpacking all these terms. Oh, but I really want her to
Yeah, you
Okay.
want to hear. Okay,
So,
we'll get after filler in the meantime. I want to hear more. I'd love to hear more about some of the objections that people had to the essay. What were they feeling like you were missing that was bugging them?
I think part of it was the title, which at least on the internet was "My Daughter's Not Transgender, She's a Tomboy," which felt like really in the essay it says I have no idea what's going to happen later.
Right.
You know?
Right.
So it felt very didactic and aggressive, and people took it as blaming trans people for this narrow vision of gender. And of course, later on, I would go on to find that this idea, this narrowed idea of what boys are and what girls are has been going on for 30 years without us noticing. Mm-hmm. But I guess I'll just, we don't know when she's going to be back, so I'll go into.
Hopefully our associate producer is checking on that.
So one of the things I realized very late, it took me a long, long time, and this really isn't in the book, because that's how long it took me to realize that the word gender is, oh, good. Hi.
Hey, yay, she is.
Sorry about that.
No problem. It happens all the time. Welcome.
Oh my gosh, this whole internet. I mean, it works usually. I don't know what happened just now. But I'm so sorry, Lisa. You were saying
no, that's fine. That's fine. I was just thinking, oh, I wanted you to hear what I was going to say, because I wondered what you'd think about it. But so you had asked me about like unpacking these terms, and
yes.
And then Jane had asked me about what were some of the objections. So some of it was around like the way that I talked about the word gender non-conforming, and that I was saying, like, you know, it's not about, it's, why are we sort of naming, why are we putting a special label on someone who's rejecting gender norms? Because the word gender to me is equated with norms and stereotypes.
Yeah.
And what I realized very late in the game, and I've been trying to write about quite recently, is the word gender itself means something very, very different to different groups of people. And so this kind of culture war that was reignited recently with the J.K. Rowling's tweets, and like kind of pitting feminists against trans people, which I think it's a false dichotomy, and there's plenty of overlap, but in the extreme version of culture war, I think it has to do with the way people define the word gender. And there are people for whom gender means gender identity, and they believe that how masculine or feminine they are is biological. And then there are people who believe that gender is constructed, it's societal, and it's about norms and stereotypes. And so in order for those people to feel liberated, we have to kind of say that it's not biological, right? That it's all of the ways that we use gender to oppress women, and they can't do science, they can't fight in wars, they can't be doctors, they can't vote, right? All of this stuff is about women's natural aptitude. But for other people, for people who believe that masculinity and femininity is biological, that's very important to gain acceptance and understanding and gain footholds in society. And so this is the big war. It's not about sex and gender. It's actually about competing ideas of gender. And when I say gender nonconforming, I'm talking about a kid who is cisgender and identifies with the sex assigned at birth, but is not doing what we expect that kid to do based on the body they were born with. And for other people, they think gender nonconforming is more of an identity, right? And there's no real way to solve that other than to try to understand, oh, we're using these words differently, and we have different belief systems, and we each have plenty of evidence to back up our claims. And so my interest is in sort of where can we overlap? How can we support each other? But it really took me a long time to even figure out that that's what the tension was around.
Yeah, well said. And one of the things that I realized too, that the conclusion that you drew in your book, because you spoke to all these scientists and you spoke to these sociologists and anthropologists, and debating whether or not it's hardwired versus a social construct. And I just love how beautiful you wrote. I think it was one of the paragraphs where you said, what actually starts from birth, where as parents we gender our kids. You call it the I think there's a word that you utilize, this material stuff, that actually, children actually internalize all of that, whether that we know it or not, subconsciously perhaps. And so I love that, where you were going with that argument, that are we responsible to, in terms of allowing our kids to have these polarized version of who they are as people, as individuals, and so maybe getting them putting them in a cage, really, so that when they start acting out of that cage, you stamp, society stamp these labels, as you were saying, with tomboy, and with a boy, it would have been sissy. But then again, the double standard in that tomboys, as you had so beautifully put in your book, were well-respected girls who, did things that boys did, and boys looked at them as equal, and they were doing other stuff that enabled them to be, high-functioning females in society. Whereas the men, the boys, where they were shamed, as quote-unquote sissies. So you want to talk about that as well, in terms of how the shame attached to the sissy boy, quote-unquote sissy boy, versus the privilege kind of given to the tomboy girl, and the different layers of privileges as well, which you got into in the book, in terms of the tomboy who is depicted as this white woman who is, she's pretty and but dark haired and kind of resentful, but then and then of course paired with the blonde cheerleader type, and or in terms of her class or culture, race could potentially play a role in that too. So I mean, I know this is a very lengthy like question, but just here, help us tie that in a nice bow at the end. I mean, not bow, because we're still gonna unpack this some more, but a conversation about that. What do you think about that that depiction?
I love how much, I mean, I'm grateful to you for, absorbing all of it, because there's so much in there.
I love it so much, but yeah.
I mean, one of the things, sorry, Brooklyn, I don't know if you can hear Brooklyn out here. One of the things that kept coming up was how girls were afforded this privilege of reaching over to the blue side of the pink-blue divide and encouraged. And there were so many messages, even in the 19th century, there were articles saying essentially like girls should have boyhoods. And we can talk about why that is in a minute, because it has nefarious reasons behind it. But many times in history, people were encouraging girls to be tomboys. And a great example of that is in the 1970s in the Sears catalog, which is sort of what everybody had before there was, Amazon. They had boys to girls size conversion charts, so that girls could look through the boys section and figure out what size to buy. Why we have different sizes anyway is, worth questioning. But of course, there were never any girls to boys sizes, right? There was never anything that was, let me look through the dresses and frills over here and see what comes in a size 12, for me, Harry or Billy or whatever. So that message that boys should avoid anything quote unquote girly or feminine is at least 100 years old. But and what's fascinating is that it's only that old, right? Because before that, children were generally dressed the same until they went to school. So boys and girls were having like, oh, I think she's frozen again. Or very, very still.
She's just wrapped. She can't. Oh, no. Interesting. All right, I think you should continue.
Okay.
We'll make sure she
It
hears.
looks like she's saying Facebook was having issues too.
Margaret, our assistant producer, was saying that. Yeah, maybe it's just one of those days. Damn shame. Well, hopefully she'll be back again.
Okay. I'll explain this a little bit. I'll try not to run on too much, but yeah, 100 years ago, until 100 years ago, lots of kids were wearing the same thing, and they had long hair, and they wore dresses, and they wore frills, and they wore flowers and lace. And until they went to school, and then slowly they'd start separating. And as the understanding of homosexuality as like a kind of person instead of an act became more common, then psychologists started suggesting basically that parents start raising their little boys to know that they should be men, so that they wouldn't be gay, because they thought that nurture, not nature, made you gay. So then that's the beginning of gendering kids' clothes, which is totally rooted in homophobia. So when you have a son and you don't want to put him in anything pink, that is really about don't be feminine because you won't be a real man. And that, that I found that very shocking. But again, that message to boys is repeated over and over and over again. No matter how often. Oh, here. Hi.
Welcome back.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
All right. If it happens again, I just sent an email. I'm so sorry for this whole connection.
No worries. No worries.
I think we'll just if it keeps happening, we'll just, when you come back, we'll just be so happy to see you.
So Lisa.
Oh my God, this is terrible. All right.
It's fine.
Again, Lisa was in a very good response, and I missed it.
Well, you know this story. I was kind of telling the story of how homophobia made us dress boys like little men. And so that message that femininity is bad and something to stay away from for boys continues no matter what's happening in our society. But it turns out that we also send that message to girls, and so they also, some of the kind of plague of girls' low self-esteem has to do with the fact that whatever is labeled as feminine is devalued, no matter how random it is, because pink as a girl's color is totally random, and hearts as a girl's thing, or flat, it's a crazy division of stuff that's marked as boy stuff and girl stuff. But whatever the girl stuff is, it tends to be devalued. And that's why my idea is well, what if we stop thinking of all this material world of childhood? What if we stop emphasizing that there's boy stuff and girl stuff? So just a little, I'm not radical, just less. Just do it less.
Yeah, I agree. And it's actually the next question, because what you just said feeds into the next question I was about to ask, because there was a part too where you discussed how girls internalize that, internalize how they are told that, boys are more, they have more advantage. And here there's a quote, I think it was on page 195, where he said, the sexism that 6-year-old girls start internalizing as they strip off their pink frilly dresses in favor of pants can mutate into different shapes as girls age. So can you discuss this phenomenon and whether it has any bearing? Is that, did you of course, you wrote the book, but what were your thoughts on women internalizing sexism?
Yeah, there's a phase that psychologists have dubbed the pink frilly dress to tomboy phase. And some of these social psychologists noticed that around age 6, anytime between 6 and 8, these girls who had been super into pink and princess dresses and really being a girl suddenly start saying, I hate pink, I hate dresses, I hate princesses, and they start rejecting all that stuff. And there are a lot of moms, especially feminist moms, who feel relieved, oh, the princess phase is so gross and it's infantilizing and it's all about how you look. And we think this is a good thing. But it turns, and at first they thought, oh, it's just because girls are realizing what's called gender constancy, which is that your membership in this group, boy or girl, is not dependent on what you do or what you look like. You know, in theory, it's dependent on your body, though many people don't agree with that and think boy and girl is a social category. But the way these psychologists are talking about it, it's that they learn that they can belong to this category no matter what they do or look like. But that wasn't happening with boys. Boys were not getting to this point where they understand gender constancy and then being like, oh, well, if it doesn't matter what I do, I'm going to play with dolls and dollhouses and I'm going to wear dresses to school. There's none of that, right? In fact, boys would become more rigid and like more policing of themselves and other kids to act like boys and look like boys. So they realized that what had happened actually is that these girls and the boys had all kind of internalized sexism and gender hierarchy, and that saying I hate pink is a way of like trying to push yourself away from traditional femininity because you realize everybody looks down on it. And that was so shocking to me because my younger child, who was like, and still she loves fashion and she loves makeup and she loves things that are like a little harder for me to get behind. And when she then right as I was reading about this, she and all her friends entered this phase, like as if on cue. I mean, how many of them told me proudly that they hated pink? And then I was kind of like, wait a minute, pink is like flowers and sunsets and, you know, it's beautiful. And in itself has an interesting color and I mean, interesting history in fashion. And why are we saying we hate this stuff? You know, oh, I hate glitter. I know it's bad for the environment, but I happen to love everything glittery. Them saying, I hate unicorns. I'm like, well, this is kind of a magical, beautiful fairy tale creature. No reason to hate it. And when you start looking at it and seeing we're rejecting all of this perfectly fine stuff only because it's associated with girls, how horrifying is that? And how terrible is that message to girls that anything you represent is bad? So once I learned that, I really decided that personally, I was not going to participate in this system. We were all going to wear pink in this family. And, you know, including my older daughter, who now likes pink and has a couple of pink shirts and has pink hair. And we just weren't going to do boy stuff and girl stuff in this. We weren't going to do it with clothes. We weren't going to do it with toys. We weren't going to do it with books. We weren't going to do it with toothbrushes. Nothing. You know, we just weren't going to participate. Oh man, she's frozen again.
Oh no, is she? Oh. Well, she'll be back. So while we are waiting, I do have a comment and a question from viewers.
Okay.
Bethlyn Patrick is watching, and she says, for those interested in the Victorian period, it's an effects gender and sexuality. She recommends Rachel Verona Coates' Too Much. Is that a book that you're familiar with?
No, but I know that name.
Yeah. So, but that leads into a question we had, which was about research from Patricia Young, one of our frequent viewers, wanted to know where did you look? Who did you talk to? You talked about talking to doctors, anthropologists, et cetera. Did you talk to parents as well? Did you get anecdotal kind of stuff in there? So
I really started with no knowledge, wasn't a tomboy, didn't have personal experience. And I'm a generalist, so I'm used to writing about all kinds of things and I love research. So first I started just looking at what the academic research said. What was it? A lot of it was about literature, which was not I wasn't particularly interested in that. And my editor was like, let's focus less on popular culture than actual people, the lived experience of people.
Yeah.
Which was a much harder thing to find. And there wasn't a ton of academic research, but it was pretty interesting what was there. And then there's all the research about, are there boy brains and girl brains? And there's lots of debate about it. You can find compelling evidence for like any claim you want to stake. And I went to, what was interesting is I went to 2 gender conferences. One was academic and one was more for parents, families of trans kids and gender creative kids. And at those, hi. Are you back?
Yes. Are you using your phone now? Can't quite hear your audio yet. We're getting there.
She's connecting to audio. Hi.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, so I'm on my cell phone now, so it should be smooth after this. I don't know, my PC's insane right now, so.
Okay. Having a day.
All right.
Well, Nicole, there was a viewer question, so I'm talking about research and getting back to this idea of people's opposing views of what gender is. I was talking about these 2. One of the things that I went to 2 conferences, both in the Bay Area, and they used the same research on girls who have a condition called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, which is like they get testosterone in utero. So the research shows that they have a slightly higher incidence of identifying as trans or not identifying as girls than the general population. And in one conference, this was used to prove a connection between hormones and identity. And in another conference, it was used to prove that there's not much connection because it was such a small, it was 5% versus 1%, or it was statistically insignificant to those group of social scientists. And then in another setting, it was interpreted completely differently. And that was not a problem I was going to solve other than to be aware of that, and that's where all this fighting comes from of like who needs to prove what, to legitimize themselves. But then I interviewed lots of psychologists. I interviewed dozens of people who had identified as tomboys, and I really tried to get like as wide a range of possible racially diverse, economically diverse in age, diverse in gender identity, and diverse in sexuality, to just like have them tell me their stories, and then have me in an unscientific way, in a narrative way, try to see where the stories overlapped and where they diverged.
That's exactly. I love that. I love as I read the book, I mean, it closed each chapter, or I guess you begin each chapter with case studies with these individuals who spoke about their experiences growing up. And one person in particular, I think it was towards the end, I think 191, where he started dissecting the tomboy lesbian stereotype. Which of course that's rampant, and you went through reasons why that's rampant. But also, there was also something that you said here that I think it was the books, from books to movies that tell girls or inform individuals that, if people are tomboy, girls are tomboy, then they're inclined to be lesbians. Did you believe that? And what were you shocked by what you found as you wrote this book?
Well, I suppose I knew the tomboy lesbian stereotype, and I think what was really interesting was how many adult women, especially of a certain age, that I don't think too many kids growing up today identify as tomboys or will look back on their childhoods and say they were, but women, Gen X women and a little older, something like 77% of them say that they were tomboys when they were growing up. And a very, very high percentage of trans men and lesbians also say retrospectively that they were tomboys. And retrospective studies are difficult, right? Because we're all looking back with, from our current perspective of, oh, I was always like that. But I think, my conclusion is, and there is definitely some link between childhood gender nonconformity and lesbianism. Like something is there, right? So again, I never looked at the research to say this proves, 21% you will be a lesbian. And, but my point was more, you could grow up and identify any number of ways. You can have, all of these people can have the same childhood, and they could have any kind of adulthood. And also I feel like, I wonder what you think about this, because I feel like I'm raising my kids with a kind of, not an expectation of pansexuality, but with the message that the gender identity and the genitals of your partner is of no concern to me at all. And I don't want to like rob them of the opportunity to come out to me, but I also don't want them to have to. So I feel like, what do you think of that? Am I, do they want, should I let them come out?
I was laughing out loud while I was reading it. Here's why, because I was so guilty, in my coming out era, being femme, like I was a girly girl, right? But being a femme lesbian, in the dating realm, it's kind of hard to pick up girls who don't look at you as gay because you're hyper feminine, right? So what I used to do, I would like hit on girls that are tomboys, quote unquote tomboys. Those girls were, they were athletes. And of course, I know that you are saying, no, do not call them that. They're just girls who are sporty. But I would look at those girls and I would approach them because in my mind, I'm like, okay, so yeah, you look like you could, be gay. And, so I was guilty of that in college. I was 19, I was 20, and I was like looking like, oh, well, it was so obvious if I can approach this person. But then learning from these same girls that they're straight. Most of them know, many of them, some of them, of course, our friends know, who would now laugh at this. Like, yeah, remember that time when you thought I was gay? And, married with children at this point, to men. And then, of course, there are others who are lesbians. So I love that you said, you're right. It could be anything. They could grow up and, fall in love with anyone. Who you are in terms of your love for sports or your love for jocks, for baggy pants or whatever, shouldn't really determine your sexuality. So what I think you did so beautifully in your book, Lisa, was you kind of have this line drawn between gender identity or gender and sexuality. A lot of people, when I read these kinds of books or when I read these kinds of essays, it's always like a mangle, like, you can't tell apart, you can't tell the two apart. So people get gender and sexuality confused all the time, and of course, there's people like my family members, when I did come out to them, they're like, oh, so you're becoming a man now. Like that was like the first thing to say to another woman who's attracted to women. So again, those expectations, like, no, women don't do that. What are you talking about? And so I love that you're now providing that environment for your daughters, for your children, that they can come out to you, and it's not a conversation that's gonna be picking them apart, but building them up, to say, well, I'm okay with who I love, and I'm okay with looking the way I look. So I love that.
That idea that like your body would determine who you're attracted to is, it's from my perspective is so silly, right? Like you think we should know enough now that sex and gender and sexuality don't come in any kind of neat package.
Right.
Your sex assigned at birth is not a predictor of much about you other than how people are going to treat you and what they're going to expect of you and the ideas they're going to have about you. But it's what body parts you're born with is no predictor of who you're going to love.
Right.
And, if you're a more masculine girl, there might, there's some correlation between that and being lesbian, and also sometimes not, as you know, from hitting on those tomboys. And so again, it's interesting because then some grown-up lesbians will be like, I always knew I was a lesbian because I was a tomboy. And then some of the grown-up straight women were like, everyone assumed I was a lesbian. But they actually, from where I was standing, their childhoods looked similar, although the women who identified as butch tended to know sooner, in some of these studies, there aren't a ton, than the femme women, who they were, that like their difference in the way they did gender, definitely set them apart in some way from much earlier on. Like, I am not part of that straight girl group. And especially I think at puberty, when, you're kind of expected to fall in line and you're going to start dating boys. And I mean, not in our family, but in those families, in the world you come from, and the people who were kind of like, oh, I'm not, but that's not me, not feeling that way. So then it becomes really just obvious to them, and they connect it, oh, I never was like those other girls,
It's so true. And when I was researching for Patsy, for example, there's a gender non-conforming character in Patsy named True. And True's growing up in Jamaica, where there's no terminology for that, like gender non-conformity, trans. This was set between 2008, 2018. 98 to 2008. And so her understanding of who she is or who she was, it wasn't even like a they, them. It was just that they're different from women in their society and the men. So this question of who am I? And it was researching by asking former classmates of mine who, I went to an all-girls high school in Jamaica. And the acquaintances that I had there, the classmates that I had there who were, again, I mean, just to utilize the title of people, I'm sorry, tomboy in our eyes at the time.
That's the word we had.
Those were the girls I reached out to. I'm like, what was it like for you to be forced to wear a tunic every day, to wear a uniform that put us in this, again, they're girls, but yet still, they did not like it at all. And so they had to tell me that, well, no, it was uncomfortable. But even more than that, the ones who are now gender non-conforming, that's separate from the tomboys now, the ones who are on their way to transitioning, were the ones who had it the hardest, because in their minds, they're attending an all-girls school, but they're not girls, And so that was something that gave me a lot of information in how I can utilize that in a fictional character. So I can just imagine, reading your book again and seeing the real people who this really affects, when we stamp people with labor or we put them in that box again.
Yeah. And that was something, something else I learned that I didn't realize is that this word tomboy was very liberating for some people who felt like it gave them permission to not have to do this girl thing, Oh, I'm a tomboy. We know what that is. So I can wear pants, so I can have short hair. But then there were trans people for whom that word was used really oppressively, of people saying, you are not a boy, you are not a man, you are a tomboy, and you have to stay in that box. Like, it was a different box than just traditional girl, but it was still a box that felt really constricting and oppressive. And so they have a profound distaste for the term because it didn't liberate them at all.
Exactly. And again, I mean, I'm here like selling this book, Tomboy, because I think it's a must read. It's a must read. I feel like I could see this in any gendered class in college, for to help us, formulate the right terminologies and to see people for who they are, And so I did feel it for those individuals who, they were wrongfully labeled as tomboys, but no, they're actually trans men or trans boys. So thank you for putting that as well in the book.
I hate to jump in because this is such a fantastic conversation, but unfortunately we're running out of time. Did you we have one last thing though that I think would be great to hear, Lisa, is do you feel like, based on your research and what you've learned and what you're seeing and the way things are changing, and some of the things you were just saying, Nicole, about how now, you know, people can come out and say that they're trans or they're gender non-conforming in a way they couldn't before. Do you have hope for the future of how things are evolving in our country and our culture, or the world, when it comes to gender roles? And
I am not hopeful by nature, but I think that this, you know, the tension I write about in the book is that, like, we have 71 or 73, I don't know what we have now, gender identity options on Facebook, but children's worlds are more hypergendered than in any other time in history. And there's all of this focus, really constant focus on gender identity, and people are fascinated by it, and people are liberated by the focus on it, some people. But because that is becoming the dominant definition of gender, we tend to lose sight of, guess what? Gender stereotypes and gender norms are still a thing, and they're still restrictive. And because they're woven into children's material and psychic worlds, because we're still participating in that really homophobic practice of the way that we gender their childhoods and sexist practice, we're really ignoring what's happened to kids and what the psychological implication of hypergendering their worlds are. Yeah. So it's a really strange moment when we've got all of this new understanding, and yet we seem to have lost so much of the understanding of the 1970s. I was listening to a story on NPR this morning, and it was about a compilation album of songs for trans and non-binary kids. And the woman said, oh, wow. Yeah, which is cool. But the woman said, children learn. Friends of mine. Well, she said she has a particular, view of the word gender, and it's just one view. So she said, children can learn their gender by two. But what most of the research shows is that children learn gender stereotypes by two. And their brains have not evolved enough to understand that those are stereotypes and that they're connected to the sex categories, but they don't have to operate within those stereotypes. That's what they understand. And that is how implicit bias forms, the same way it forms in regards to race, it forms in regards to gender in very, very young children, who then learn to police each other and try to perfect their group and edge their way up. And so we really need to work with children very young to try to work against gender stereotypes, because last week there was research that came out that said kids who defy gender norms do better academically. There's research that they're more creative, that they get better jobs, that they're more self-confident. Gender norms are harmful, and kids are learning them earlier and more deeply than at any other time. And this discussion seems to be absent from the media. That's why when I found this research, that's one of the many surprises in the subtitle. And I don't think, because there's a tendency to say, my kid just liked this stuff, it's biological, it's got nothing to do with culture, because people are not aware of how our culture has changed. So part of my project is to get people to understand how gender, sex, and sexuality have been understood at different times, how we understand them now. Don't lose sight of what we learned before as we gather new knowledge. Don't have it replace what we know, have it add to it, have it be complicated. And the one thing I say to people over and over again is, be wary of anyone who says that anything about gender is simple. It's complicated, and let's try to handle it being complicated, ambiguous, and difficult, and then see where we get.
Wonderful. Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Fantastic. I'm super excited to read this book, and I'm sure that all of you who have been watching probably are as well. So be sure to pick up a copy of Tomboy. You can get it via our bookshop.org page, where there that book is listed, along with Patsy by Nicole Dennis-Benn, and I think you can access their other books from there as well. So I hope you will pick them up. We didn't get you to hold up your book, Nicole. Can we quickly get you
yes.
to hold up Patsy so you can get, yes, this is Nicole's latest.
Yes.
She recently won a Lambda Award, I believe, right?
Yes.
Yes, that's great. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Nicole.
This was a pleasure. Yes, I could have gone on all day, Lisa. Thank you so much again for this beautiful book.
Thank you for getting it. Thank you for being into it. It makes me so happy. And thank you, Jane, for having us.
Sure, our pleasure. All right. So long, everybody.
Take care. Bye.